20th centuries. And we have Ray Frank, who is spent a good chunk of her life in California, also in Chicago. We'll read parts of her bio. And Regina Jonas, who lived in Germany and elsewhere. We will see that when the time comes. All right, so let us start with Ray Frank. First of all, have any of you been to the museum in Philadelphia, the Jewish History Museum? There is, so Susan's been there, Myrna, Sandy, Carol. Okay, so in that museum, there's a wonderful exhibit of modern Jewish life. I forget which floor it's on, but Ray Frank is featured in there pretty prominently. So have any of you heard of her or remember seeing the exhibit about her in the Philadelphia Museum? If not, I do have what I can share with you. So first, raise your hand.
I didn't.
Yes.
Rabbi, I didn't go. I don't remember what I saw at the exhibit, but I had done a study group with Hadass about a program about Jewish women, and she was one of them. So I did learn a little bit about her.
A little bit about her. Okay. Yes, she's, so we'll see. So you'll be able to chime in and add whatever. I do have I'm going to share the screen with some images that I pulled just from Google Images. Okay. So this is the common picture that we see of Ray Frank. This is a picture of Ray Frank with her husband, who last name is Littman. So that's a name that's familiar to some of us. You might see some of the headlines here. First woman rabbi, a California girl to be so ordained, work of a woman rabbi, Ray Frank's opinions on large subjects. So this is to give you a little bit of an idea of where we're heading, who she was. In the museum, I believe she's referred to as the rabbi of the Wild West, or I've heard her also referred to as a latter-day Rebecca. So all kind of interesting tidbits about Ray Frank. So let us open up this document. And because I shared it in the chat, I'm not going to put it on the screen. If you could just raise your hand to let me know that you can see it, so I'll know if you'll be able to read. Okay, so Denise can see it, Ruth, Susie. All right, we have a few people. Okay, so those of you who can see it, I guess you'll have to listen. But we'll start out with what I have in the handout.
Sorry, how do I get off here?
Put yourself on mute. If you have background stuff going on, that would be great. All right, Risa, since you were the one to raise your hand about this, why don't you read the first piece here, journalist Ray Frank.
Journalist Ray Frank made her name as a latter-day Rebecca. She was the first Jewish woman to preach from the pulpit in America, and was known for her ability to bring feuding Jewish religious factions together. Boy, do we need her now. My position this evening is a novel one. To be at any time asked to give counsel to my people would be a mark of esteem. But on this night of nights, on Yom Kippur Eve, to be requested to talk to you, to advise you, to think that perhaps I am tonight the one Jewish woman in the world, mayhap the first since the time of the prophets, to be called on to speak to such an audience as I now see before me, is indeed a great honor. Ray Frank's continue or stop?
Keep going.
Ray Frank's position in American Jewry was truly a novel one. In 1890, she became the first Jewish woman to preach formally from a pulpit in the United States, inaugurating a career as the girl rabbi of the Golden West that would help to blaze new paths for women in Judaism. Virtually overnight, Frank became a sensation in the Jewish world, and she would remain so for nearly a decade. Coinciding with a broader emergence of public roles for Jewish women, Frank's career reinvigorated and redirected an ongoing conversation about the proper boundaries of the female sphere. Earlier in the 19th century, women like Rebecca Gratz had explored new responsibilities in many areas, including education and philanthropy. But the expansion of American Jewish women's social and cultural opportunities had not been matched by expansion of their religious roles. Although women had become the majority at many congregant services, their participation in public ritual was still limited to the occasional mixed-sex choir. Despite the fact that Frank claimed to have no interest in becoming a rabbi, her actions forced American Jewry to consider the possibility of the ordination of women seriously for the first time. Frank spoke passionately about the abilities and spirituality of Jewish women and had no doubt about the necessity of their becoming a greater presence in the synagogue. The content of her speeches and her presence as a female religious leader not only served as an inspiration to the women who heard her, but also demonstrated to the Jewish world that Jewish women were ready for widespread change.
That's a nice overview of Ray Frank. A little bit more about her biography. Some of it is included in this link, but I wanted to share with you an excerpt from a book that I have that you may be familiar with. It's called Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985 by Pamela S. Nadell. And actually, it's interesting, it ends at 1985 because the first conservative woman rabbi wasn't ordained until 1987. That was Rabbi Amy Eilberg. But here there is in the early chapters of this book, these are women who didn't consider themselves rabbis, were not seeking the title rabbi, did not go to rabbinical school, but they did certain types of things that were considered to be rabbinic and later became considered part of a rabbinic role. Susan, you had a question?
Yeah, when was Rabbi Sally Presand?
So Rabbi Sally Presand, who was at the Monmouth Reform Temple, she was the first woman who was officially ordained as a rabbi in any movement. That was the Reform movement, Hebrew Union College. That was in 1972.
Right.
And then the next woman to be ordained officially from an institution was Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, who was from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College is a school that didn't open until later. So they were admitting and ordaining women from the beginning. So that was 1974, just 2 years after Rabbi Sally became ordained. And then at Rabbi Amy Eilberg, actually, you know what? Rabbi Amy Eilberg, I think, was ordained in 85. I think in 87, there was some kind of rulings for the future within JTS, but Rabbi Amy Eilberg already had been in rabbinical school, but not as an official student. She was taking classes with the male rabbinical students. So that could be why why this book ends in 1985. Yes, Denise, you have a question?
Those dates that you're mentioning?
Yes.
Is that just for American people or what about worldwide?
Okay, so it's an excellent question. So America was the first country to ordain women officially as rabbis. Now I say officially because it's interesting in the male realm of ordination, smicha, not all male rabbis went to a school per se. Many of them are ordained by a rav, a rabbi, his individual smicha. The word smicha itself means the laying on of hands, and it's a word that appears biblically. It appears in the book of Vayikra all over the place. It has to do with animal sacrifice. Before you sacrifice an animal, you put the person doing the sacrificing puts his hands on the animal's head as a way of saying you are designated for holiness. So that's smicha. So that's been happening for men for years, and they don't necessarily have to go to an institution. With women, there have been women in recent years, particularly ones who they consider themselves Orthodox. The rabbis consider themselves Orthodox. The Orthodox institutional community writ large does not consider them Orthodox, but they have smicha. My dear friend Avital Hochstein is a rabbi, and she was ordained by Rabbi Danny Lehman. So she didn't go to JTS or HUC or Reconstructionist Rabbinical College or Hebrew College. But Denise, all of this was, but in America is where women first started getting recognized as rabbis. But spoiler alert, the second woman we're going to be studying today, Regina Jonas, she never considered herself a rabbi, but as you'll see from her story, when we look at it, she was someone who was not in America, who was taking strides towards doing what we might consider rabbinic work abroad. The Reform movement, incidentally, started in Germany and only then came to the United States. But the women's aspect within the women becoming equals, the movement becoming egalitarian, was not part of Reform Judaism at its inception, and certainly not in Europe, more so in America. Okay, so a little bit about Ray Frank as an individual. She was born in San Francisco. As you can see from the link, she was she was born in 1861. And in the 19th century, San Francisco was actually the largest Jewish community in the West. It was primarily a secular Jewish community. Some Reform movement, people who affiliated with Reform, the first synagogues that were in San Francisco were Reform. In one of the synagogues, I worked at a Reform synagogue in San Francisco called Shereth Israel, and they have a beautiful stained glass window of Moses. It looks to me, always I thought it was when I first walked in, Moses in front of Mount Sinai, and it's actually Moses at Yosemite, and they have like there's California backgrounds, there's Yosemite, Yellowstone, places in the West. San Francisco was referred to as Zion of the Golden Gate by some members of the Jewish community. So to say that someone was born in San Francisco was a big deal in 1861 because it was a very big Jewish community, but a very different kind of Jewish community than what we are more used to on the East Coast. It started with Reform, and later on, when Polish Jews wanted to immigrate to America and wanted to come to the San Francisco Bay Area, the German Jews, who were mostly Reform, were none too happy. They tried to negotiate to buy land from Mexico to send the Polish Jews there. They figured if they want to come, like we want to save them, refugees, great, but we don't want them in our neighborhood because they look too Jewish, they act too Jewish, they sound too Jewish. And in fact, Shereth Israel did have some Eastern European Jews, whereas Temple Emmanuel, which is the premier Reform synagogue in San Francisco, was very classical Reform, and that was the group that originally didn't want the Eastern Europeans in. But the Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans and all other kind of Jews are all integrated now in the Bay Area, as far as I know. Frank, incidentally, was the daughter of Ray Frank was the daughter of Polish immigrants. She did come from a traditional family. One side of her family, I forget if it was her mom's side or her dad's side, can trace their lineage back to the Vilna Gaon. And she was a teacher and a journalist. So pieces of what she did involved writing, involved studying, involved speaking. And so she was a teacher in Nevada for a little while in a small mining town. And at some point she returned to California. She lives in Oakland, California, and she studied philosophy at Berkeley and began teaching what we call today Hebrew school. Then it was called Sabbath school. And Sabbath school sometimes met on Sunday, sometimes met on Shabbat. And she was known for giving very charismatic lectures. So when the congregation's rabbi resigned in Oakland, she took over the running of the school, and that kind of set the stage for her doing some rabbinic work. In May, I'm going to read you something here, a letter. In May 1890, she wrote a lengthy letter to the editor of the Jewish Messenger, which is the local Jewish paper in the Bay Area. And he had asked his readers to consider the question, what would you do if you were a rabbi? And she responded by saying, what I would do, this is what I would not do if I were a rabbi. And she wrote an article of things she would not do, including, what did she write here? She decried the materialism of the rabbinate, the selling of religion in the form of pews and benches to the highest bidder. This is her words. She decried the unbridled animosity between Reform and Orthodox rabbis. And she also wrote, women are precluded from entering the Holy of Holies, but it is a great satisfaction to contemplate what we would not do were the high office not denied us. And after writing this letter, Ray Frank, she gained her first experience of what that high office would be like, because she started to lead high holiday services. And when I say leading high holiday services, she mostly was giving sermons. So in 1890, she led a high holiday service in Washington State, Bobby, right? So on the eve of, I can't remember if it was Erev Rosh Hashanah or if it was Kol Nidre or Yom Kippur, but in Spokane, Washington, she spoke. And it happened coincidentally, because no one was looking for a rabbi. She learned that there weren't going to be any high holiday services in the whole city, in the area, in Washington State. So she approached one of the Jews who had money there, and he agreed to arrange for services, but only if she would agree to be the preacher. And so she did. And the place where they held the services was the Spokane Falls Opera House. And
Wow.
yeah, you may be familiar with that, Bobby, right?
No, I've driven halfway across the state, but not all the way to Spokane.
Okay, so I don't know if the Opera
Not to
House
the Grand Coulee
there.
Dam. I will get there though.
Yeah, and one of the things she did during that sermon is she chastised those who assembled for failing to build a synagogue. You want high holiday services so much. Why are you not building a shul? And she was very active, very outspoken, mostly in a speaking and writing capacity. And she was very active in this kind of para-rabbinic circuit, but then stopped when she got married. She got married to someone named Simon Littman in 1901. And until then, she was really known as the Jewess in the pulpit, and as a latter-day Rebecca, a latter-day Deborah, all different kind of titles were attributed to her. So let's go back to the link to see if there's any other parts of her bio that you might, it's all interesting, but Lisa read some of it out loud. Let's see if there's anything else here that I had want to cover. She's very interesting. All right, so if you look at, here, I'm going to read to you a quote on page 5 of the link that I sent you under the section entitled Early Influences. And this is also all taken from the website, the Jewish Women's Archive. In italics is a direct quote from Ray Frank. She writes, "Although reared among non-Jews, my childhood's home being in the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains and later on in the state of Nevada, I, at an early age, became much interested in all that concerned the Jews. Living where prejudices of a theological kind were unknown, one of the prime factors of this early interest was the desire to understand the cause and meaning of prejudice against the Jew." So what motivated her very much to speak about Judaism was she was very interested in Jews as being part of a people, not just as a religion. The religious aspect interested her, but the peoplehood as well. If you turn in your link to page 9, there's a section here of her bio entitled "The Maiden in the Temple." And at the bottom of the page, another direct quote from Ray Frank. She writes or says, is a sermon that she delivered on the eve of Yom Kippur. And she said, "Drop all dissension about whether you should take off your hats during the service and other unimportant ceremonials and join hands in one glorious cause." And what she's referring to there is in the classical reform movement, which was very much taking hold in San Francisco at the time, the attitude towards wearing kippot and keeping kosher was very antagonistic. So it wasn't like the reform movement today, which very much values personal autonomy, personal choice. You can wear a kippah, you don't have to wear a kippah. It's not required, but we're not going to look down upon you. We're not going to force you to take a kippah off. In the days of Ray Frank, there were Reform synagogues in the Bay Area that were not allowing men to wear a kippah. It wasn't just a matter of choice. So that is, I wanted you to see that quote. And another quote of hers on page 11 of this link, the section entitled "Breaking Down Barriers." She, in the end of the second paragraph, she says, "I know that it is unusual and that in the history of our people, no woman except Deborah spoke in the synagogue, yet the experience did not seem strange," she commented. And it's interesting that she mentions Deborah because in the times of biblical Deborah, there were no synagogues. I mean, there were prayer contexts and contexts where people gather to study Jewish texts. But she, in her mind, in her imagination, she's projecting Deborah into a synagogue context, and it's, in a sense, comparing herself to Deborah. Not a bad comparison to draw. And if you look, the final piece I wanted to share with you about Ray Frank here, and if you could all pull it up, because then maybe some of you can read, on page 15, there's a title here that says "The First Woman Rabbi," and it's not the first woman rabbi, period. It's the first woman rabbi, question mark. Like, is she a rabbi? What is a rabbi? Why was she referred to as a rabbi? And raise your hand if you have pulled it up, because I'd like somebody else to read. Ruth. Go ahead, Ruth. You need to unmute. Oh, you are unmuted. Okay, go ahead.
Not content with the novelty of Frank's position as the first woman since Deborah to preach in a synagogue, the press began to speculate about her rabbinical aspirations. Despite Frank's protestations that she had none, rumors swirled. The buzz about Frank's potential ordination increased in 1893 when she enrolled in courses in Jewish ethics and philosophy at Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary in Cincinnati. Although not the first female student there, Frank was apparently the first to be taken seriously. Rabbi Isaac Meyer Weiss, president of the HUC, welcomed her with open arms. We glory in her zeal and moral courage to break down the last remains of the barriers erected in the synagogue against women, he wrote. In the laws governing the Hebrew Union College, the question of sex or race or confession is not touched upon at all. I didn't know we had confession. We can only encourage Miss Ray Frank or any other gifted lady who takes the theological course to assist the cause of emancipating women in the synagogue and the congregation. In the 1890s, several Christian denominations had already ordained women ministers, and it appeared to many observers that the Jews were about to follow suit. Reform Rabbi Emil G. Hirsch published an editorial advocating the ordination of women as a way to revitalize Judaism, and many others appeared to take for granted that, just as women were moving into a wide variety of other professions, they would soon enter the rabbinate. 17 of the 26 women, Orthodox and Reform, who contributed to Hirsch's 1897 symposium on women in the synagogue were at least willing to consider the ordination of women. But the debates about the possibility of women rabbis were fierce, with prominent figures weighing in on both sides.
I'm going to stop you there for a moment, Ruth. So I'm reading again now from this book, Women Who Would Be Rabbis by Pamela Nadel. And this is Pamela Nadel is a historian, so it's written very much from a historical, not a religious perspective. But she actually picks up, talks about this Reform Rabbi Emil G. Hirsch. And apparently, according to Nadel's research, he was very much opposed, not to women being rabbis in general or women taking on rabbinic roles, but specifically was opposed to Ray Frank calling herself a rabbi or other people referring to her as a rabbi. I don't think she referred to herself as a rabbi so much as other people did in Newsline headlines. And his issue with her, and I'll just read what he said. He said he felt that you needed to have necessary training for this exalted calling. He thought that Ray Frank, she just had taken, as in his words, despite some collegiate coursework, she lacks the formal credentials beyond a high school diploma. And he argued, and again, a direct quote, zeal, good intentions, fervor, depths of religious convictions cannot make up for ignorance on all or most questions of Jewish theology or history and literature. Rabbi Hirsch expected rabbis to have strong education backgrounds in Jewish texts, Jewish living, Jewish study, but also philosophy, classics, psychology, history, and religious thought. And he just did not feel that Ray Frank had not only the credentials in terms of an actual degree, but that she did not have the deep knowledge base that was necessary to be a rabbi. In fact, his last word on the subject here in this book is, let us, if we must, have women rabbis, but let them be not only women, but also rabbis. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that was his take. Betty Ann, you had a comment or question? You need to unmute, Betty. Betty Ann, we still can't hear you. Try again. Still can't hear you. Okay, if you have a question or a comment that you want to type in the chat and oh no,
Okay.
now you're good. Okay.
It's too long.
Okay, go ahead, Betty.
I am wondering at what point then do the men need additional education? Because it was my impression, especially people I knew in the Orthodoxy who had gotten a smicha from a rabbi, from a highly, highly respected rabbi who would teach the other person, and then that other person would become a rabbi. I didn't know there was a formalized education for men, so I was wondering when that started.
Yeah,
Since he's complaining
there
she doesn't
is.
have
I
it.
mean, right. So in terms of having a college degree, that is not something that has been really, that is more 20th century. But in terms of having some type of learning path that is formal and not just picking stuff up on your own and not being just a couple of years here and there, that's been part and parcel of male smicha for years. I think it's different. Like, I'm not sure, I forget. I spoke to Rabbi Tesser about this once. I can't remember what his training is, but I think in some Orthodox communities, including his, you can do the equivalent of rabbinical school as your college degree. So it's kind of like having a Jewish studies plus major. People, though, who are ordained from YU, they generally have an undergraduate degree in something that may or may not be a Jewish studies. And then in addition to that, rabbinical school is considered graduate school. So for people who, men and women today, but I'm thinking Orthodox men who are ordained from institutions, they're all post, at least, even in the Orthodox world, for most of them, the more mainstream Orthodox rabbis, they are going to college first, and then they're getting a rabbinical degree somewhere else. Okay, any last words on Ray Frank before we move on to Regina Jonas, moving from the United States, the West Coast primarily, to Germany, Lahavdil. Okay, so it's in the very same link that I sent you, and I see some people, Elaine and Alice just joined, so I'll put the link in there for you if you want to open that up. That's what we're reading from. So we just finished talking about Ray Frank, the quote unquote rabbi, depending who you ask, of the West, of the Wild West, the latter-day Rebecca, latter-day Deborah. And now we're going to move on to Regina Jonas. And Regina Jonas is all the way on page 33 here. Okay, so while you're gathering that, Regina Jonas lived from 1902 to 1944. You can imagine if she died in 1944, how she met her ends. Yes, she did die during the Holocaust. Before we read her story in adult form, I wanted to share with you a children's version, and that I will share on the screen. And I'd say a children's version loosely. It's a book written by Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, who is the Reconstructionist woman that I mentioned earlier, the first female to be ordained from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. She in later years decided to become a children's book author. And so she has written lots of books that are Jewish topics, some of them published by Jewish Lights. I forget what this one is, Apples and Honey Press. So let me show you the book, and I will share the screen because the pictures are lovely. Sure. Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this. That's the cover of the book. Okay, Regina persisted. And I need to move your pictures, your gallery, so I can see what's here. All right, Regina Persisted, An Untold Story by Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, illustrated by Margot Lucas. Okay, Apples and Honey Press. Here's a nice quote by Regina Jonas at the beginning, opening of the book. I hope a time will come for all of us in which there will be no more questions on the subject of women. For as long as there are questions, something is wrong. Interesting. Yes, chuckles for that. Oh, couldn't preview. Okay, why is that not working? Okay, I may have to show you the book in real time. I don't know why it didn't. One more attempt at that one. Okay, I'm going to do the old-fashioned way. I'll show you the actual book. Good thing I have the hard copy of the book with me. All right, there's the book. Okay.
Wait, a little slower.
Move to the side and read like I'm reading in a library. Okay. Regina's heart was racing. She knew she needed a good night's rest, but she couldn't sleep. Tomorrow was the last day of her studies, and she was going to take the most important test of all. If she passed this test, she would become a rabbi. When the sun rose, Regina was already awake. She brushed and pinned her thick dark hair. She put on her favorite green velvety dress with the puffy sleeves. Her mother had breakfast on the table, but Regina couldn't eat. Regina left for school early. The streets of Berlin were busy with bicycles, horse-drawn carriages, and motor cars. Peddlers called out their wares. The smells of fish, fresh lemon, and sweet spices filled the air. "Why so fast today, Regina?" shouted one of the peddlers as she ran past his pushcart, overflowing with fruits and vegetables. "This is one day I am not going to be late," she called back. Another peddler tossed a fresh roll to Regina and said, "You know what the rabbis say, if there is no bread, there is no Torah." That's from Pirkei Avot. It's Im ein Kemach ein Torah. Regina smiled and thanked him as she flew past. Regina thought about the moments that had led to this day. As she nibbled on the warm bread, she daydreamed. She saw herself in her dark, damp apartment, placing her stuffed animals in 2 rows. Some had little hats on their heads. Regina pretended to read from the Torah and then raised it for all her furry friends to see. While her girlfriends played house, Regina played rabbi. Most people in 1913 didn't believe that girls should receive a religious education. They thought girls only needed to learn to make Shabbat and prepare a proper kitchen. But Regina's father taught both his son and his daughter Torah and Hebrew. When Regina was 12 years old, her father died. Sadness filled the house. Regina said the memorial prayers with her brother and mother at her father's grave. And she made a promise. "I will carry on the traditions of my father. Maybe I will even become a rabbi." Her mother smiled sadly and said, "No woman has ever been a rabbi." "Not yet," Regina replied. "I will be what I will be." Saturday mornings, Regina walked with her brother and mother to shul. Regina hardly noticed the other boys and girls darting in and out of bushes, playing hide and seek. The synagogue, with its big round arches and beautiful ark, was her favorite place. There, she felt at home. Sometimes, after everyone else had left the synagogue, Regina would stay to study with the rabbi. "You are a good student. Would you like to learn more about Judaism?" he asked. Regina smiled and nodded. But people complained. "Stop wasting your time studying with the rabbi. You should learn to cook and sew like the other girls." Regina heard, but she persisted. Honk, neigh, the street sounds interrupted Regina's daydreams. The drivers of a horse-drawn carriage and a motor car were yelling, "Fraulein, stop dreaming, watch where you are going." Regina arrived at school before any of the other students. She loved the scent of old books that filled the halls. She thought about her final essay for the class in which she had asked, "Can women serve as rabbis?" Her answer was, yes, they can. And her teachers agreed. At least that's what Regina thought. But when she came to take her test, one of the professors stopped her. "Regina," he said, "I cannot let you take this exam. Stop trying to be a rabbi." "You won't be, not now, not ever." Regina's voice broke. "There are women doctors, lawyers, and teachers. There will be a woman rabbi. God created man and woman, and the world cannot be held up by men alone." The rabbi could not look Regina in the eye. "You'll get over this, my dear. With time, you will change your mind." He turned and left Regina alone. For a moment, Regina could not move. She could barely breathe. "I will be what I will be," she said to the empty room. Regina told her teachers, friends, and neighbors that someday she would be a rabbi. They warned, "Be careful, don't make trouble. Be a teacher like other women. See how Regina dresses. She doesn't look like a rabbi." Do what you're supposed to do. Go home and cook. Women are not smart enough. But Regina persisted. She was tired of being interrupted when she spoke. She was tired of being told what she could not do because she was a woman. She was tired of people telling her that when she got older, she would change her mind. She continued teaching even without being called rabbi. Often Regina would arrive at school late. Out of breath from running, her dress wrinkled. She would sit on her desk and take out the sandwich she had forgotten to eat. She loved her students and they loved her. It didn't matter that she was messy and her clothes old-fashioned. Regina always looked her students straight in the eyes. It was as if she could tell what each one was thinking. She taught the girls in her class, use your eyes, ears, hands, and mouth so that you can see, hear, touch, and taste what it is to be a Jew. Some parents did not see the point of their daughters studying Torah, but Regina persisted. She told them, there have been lots of strong Jewish women. Miriam was a prophet and a great leader. She led the women in dance and song after crossing the Sea of Reeds. Miriam, Deborah, and Esther were leaders from the Bible, brave and wise. Your daughters can do great things someday too. Deborah was a great prophet and a wise judge. Esther had the courage to speak out against those who wanted to destroy her people. It was a hard time to be a Jew in Germany. A group called the Nazis had come to power. People were told not to shop in Jewish stores. There were signs saying, do not buy from Jews. Many Jews were afraid and decided to leave Germany. But Regina stayed. My mother is too old to start a new life in a new country, she said. My place is here with my people. Regina kept studying. 1 year passed, then 2. Regina persisted. She kept teaching. She attracted large crowds of people. Often there was standing room only. 3 years passed, then 4. Regina persisted. In dark times, she taught her students to find joy in Jewish holidays and to dance. Every year, Regina applied to take the test to become a rabbi, and every year she was told no. Finally, after 5 years, the rabbis and teachers of Berlin began to see Regina clearly. They saw how much she learned. They saw her gift for teaching. They saw the way she cared for others. They saw her love for the Jewish people. They saw a woman who was already acting like a rabbi in so many ways. On December 26, 1935, Regina Jonas was finally allowed to take the test. She passed. At long last, she was a rabbi, the very first woman rabbi in the whole world. So it's a little bit, it's fictionalized a bit and written for children, but the gist of the story is true. And now we can look at the adult version of the story and fill in some of the blanks. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Regina Jonas. So this is the first time for most of you, all of you. Yes, it's really wonderful story. You wonder if she had lived, God willing, what would have happened. She did. There was such it says she passed the test. I'm not exactly sure what this test was, but she did lecture and she did teach and she did provide pastoral care in her community. And eventually she was sent to, first she was sent to Theresienstadt and she taught in Theresienstadt as well. So in a sense, some historians write about her time at Theresienstadt as her serving as a rabbi in Theresienstadt. Whether she was rabbi or not, she was certainly teaching and being a pastoral presence to others. And then in 1944, she was taken to Auschwitz and was murdered. For more than 40 years after she was killed, no one told her story. So that could be why you haven't heard of her. But if you do have the link, I'll put the link up again for those who join later. I'm all the way now at page 33. Actually 34. Let's do a little bit more of her background. So would someone like to read who has access to it? Ruth was able to read it before. Can someone else see it and would like to read? Susie?
Regina Jonas was born in Berlin on August 3rd, 1902, the daughter of Wolf and Sarah Jonas. She grew up in the Schönenviertel, a poor, mostly Jewish neighborhood. Her father, a merchant who died of tuberculosis in 1913, was probably her first teacher. Early on, Regina Jonas felt her rabbinic vocation. Her passion for Jewish history, Bible, and Hebrew was apparent even at high school, where fellow pupils recall her talking about becoming a rabbi. Many people supported Jonas's interests, among them the Orthodox rabbi Isidore Bleckrode, Felix Singerman, and Max Wheel, the last of whom was known for his open attitude regarding religious education for girls.
Okay, stop there for a moment, Susie. We're just going to skip. There's a lot of unpronounceable words in the next paragraph that I will spare you from. But the second paragraph at the end, it says she did attend a teacher's seminary. And so that was when she got the certification to be able to teach Jewish subjects in a girls' school in Berlin. And then there's another school that she matriculated in Berlin in 1872. And did someone have a question? No, okay. And when you talk about the test that she was going to take in this book that we read about her, in the last paragraph here, we have mentioned Edward Baneth, who was a professor of Talmud at the Hochschule, and he was the one who was responsible for rabbinic ordination. He's the one who's featured in the book I just read. He was the supervisor of Jonas's final thesis, and that topic was, may a woman hold rabbinic office? That's alluded to in the children's book that I shared with you. And one thing that we didn't read in the children's book that's mentioned here in this biography is that the paper was the first known attempt to find a halachic basis for the ordination of women. So it went beyond the issue of women's rights in the secular sphere and became more of a religious issue. So if you turn to page 35, the top of the page, if someone would like to read the first two paragraphs, we get a little sense of what her arguments were, the nature of her arguments in this book. Who has it in front of them? Anybody? If not, I'll have Carol. So Carol, you need to unmute first. And for those of you who just hopped on late, this was the book that we read, that I read, Regina Persisted, an Untold Story by Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, the children-ish version of Regina Jonas's story as wanting to become a rabbi in Berlin. Okay, Carol, go ahead. Jonas combines a
halakhic line of argument with a modern attitude. She did not know the reform movement, which was willing to achieve modernization by abandoning halakha. Rather, she wanted to deduce gender equality from the Jewish legal sources. The female rabbinate should be understood as a continuity of tradition. This proves Jonas's independence both from orthodoxy, which held equality as incompatible with halakha, and from reform, which saw itself as the sole advocate of female emancipatory interests. On the opening page of her thesis, Jonas writes, "I personally loathe this profession, and if ever possible, I also want to practice it." On the last page, she concludes, "Almost nothing halakhically but prejudice can lack of familiarity stand against women holding rabbinic office."
Keep going, Carol.
Since rabbinic literature did not deal with ordination per se, Jonas embraces a halakhic literature which relates more generally to women's issues. She names important women who, though not holding the title rabbi, fulfilled rabbinical functions, most specifically as decisors of halakha. In addition to rabbinical protagonists, she mentions Talmudic personalities such as Yehuda, Yalta, the Hasmonean queen, Salome Alexandra, and also Rashi's daughters and granddaughters who were involved in halakhic decision-making. She quotes negative Talmudic statements about women, not only countering them with positive statements, but also contextualizing them by quoting equally negative statements about great sages. Jonas distinguishes between immutable statutes of divine origin on the one hand and opinions of individual rabbis on the other. For her, the vitality of a prohibition depends on the reasoning behind it, not on the prohibition as such.
Okay, so I thought that was interesting. I should tell you that the first book I shared with you before the children's book, but this book, Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, by Pamela S. Nadel. This is more of a historical overview, but there's another book that book came out. Let me see what the copyright is. I don't see a date on it. Oh, 1998. So Nadel's book was first published in 1998. There's this other book that came out that does deal more with halachic issues of women, what women can do, are able to do, should be allowed to do, prohibited from doing in Jewish ritual. This came out in 1988 from the Jewish Theological Seminaries of America. So this is not about Regina Jonas. It's not about Ray Frank. It's about when the issue came on the table of women becoming rabbis at JTS. As I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Amy Eilberg was the first woman to be ordained by JTS, the first conservative rabbi, first female conservative rabbi. And she was going to school in the 1980s. And then in 1985, they decided to let her graduate with her male classmates and to have the title rabbi. But there's this book that deals with more of the halachic issues, which is The Ordination of Women as Rabbis, Studies and Responsa, edited by Simon Greenberg. And in this book, rather than having a historical approach, there are a couple of tshuvot, quite a few tshuvot. One's written by Rabbi Gerson Cohen, Rabbi Gordon Tucker, Rabbi Joseph Brody, Rabbi Israel Frankis, Rabbi Robert Gordis, Rabbi Simon Greenberg, Rabbi Meir Rabinowitz, Rabbi David Roskis, Rabbi Joel Roth, and also an article submitted by someone who's not a rabbi, but who is married to a rabbi and has a PhD and taught at JTS for years, Ann Lerner. So if you're interested more in that piece of it, not the historical piece, but more of the halachic issues involved, that's what this book is. But that's beyond the scope of our class today. Susan, you had a question.
Since you're talking about history, Rabbi Amy Levin, she like the second ordained or something, or she was more?
I'm not sure. It's hard to say who was second because the first was Amy was in school taking classes with male rabbinical students. And then when it was approved in the conservative movement, there were women coming up the pike who would then start rabbinical school, but wouldn't graduate for another 5 years. So there were others like Amy Levin who were in one of those first classes. So so it's hard to say who was second because the incoming rabbinical school classes had more than one woman. There were multiple women. So like who went first? I guess if you were earlier in the alphabet, you could be considered first. But Amy Eilberg was taking classes in the hopes that she would become a rabbi, but even if not, she was still going to be taking classes. And that's very much what Regina Jonas did. When I was reading the beginning of her story, she didn't go to rabbinical school. She went to a school where males were being trained to be rabbis, and she was learning, but not necessarily having the realistic expectation that she would someday receive this title for whatever the title's worth.
Yeah. It's just because we Temple Beth Am encountered Rabbi Amy Levin. I mean, I remember her and actually had
what was Temple Beth Am's history with Rabbi Levin?
She was we interviewed her in a previous rabbi search.
Oh, interesting.
It was, and I kept up with her, and so you may run across her, I'm sure, in Israel when you're.
No, I'm friends with her. She is some. I don't know if you've been seeing, but some weeks I send out, in addition to sending out, or instead of sending out a Devar Torah or teaching, I send out resilience articles, and those Amy Levin put together. Like she put a whole bunch together for the Rabbinical Assembly to use. So I will tell her you say hello.
Oh, please do. Please do. She's
amazing. She, by the way, is one of the rabbis who wrote, it wasn't a tshuva, it was just a dissent to the tshuva on Zooming and live streaming on Shabbat.
I know, I saw that. I mean, for me personally, she and I had a long email discussion for me to reach a point where I was comfortable wearing a tallis. And so she was sort of my virtual rabbi on that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So
I will tell her.
Yeah.
I hope to spend some time with her in the fall. Does anyone have any other comments or questions, either about Regina Jonas, Ray Frank, historical or halachic issues relating to women that I mentioned during this part of the class. Elaine.
The lady who about Regina Jonas, she was the first one who, as an Orthodox rabbi, is that correct?
No, she was not an Orthodox rabbi. Regina Jonas, there were Orthodox rabbis who were supportive at the time in Germany of girls receiving a religious education, and she studied with some of them, but she did not get what would be known as Orthodox smicha. No.
Okay, so was she like one of the first where female Reform rabbis followed her? Because Reform Judaism had female rabbis way before.
Yes, so someone asked the question, we talked about very early part of the class, I don't think you were on yet, but Rabbi Sally Priesand, she was the first female rabbi to be officially ordained as a female rabbi among all the movements, and she was Reform, and she was ordained by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati.
So she was right here at the Monmouth Reform Temple.
Yes, she was at Monmouth Reform Temple for many years and still there as emerita. And Regina Jonas, like, we don't know what would have happened had she lived, right? Like, look what happened. This whole spiritual journey of hers happened at the same time as the Holocaust. So we never know what her trajectory would have been and if she might have been the first. Denise early on, very at the beginning of this session, asked about what was going on in other countries, because we were looking at, we're talking about Ray Frank being in the United States, and was she the first female rabbi? Was there something going on in Europe? Women were not yet officially being ordained as rabbi in Europe, and just at the time where they might have been, other historical horrors took precedence and did not take hold. I don't know if is that you, Elaine?
Sandy, you're in two different places, and so I think one of yours is showing up.
One of them is completely muted. So.
Yeah.
I think it was Elaine, because I turned off Elaine's sound and the echoing.
Oh.
If all else, we could always blame it on your pinball machine, although it's so quiet. And
Just
looks like a virtual background.
Can you hear me?
I just wanted to make one other comment when you said that her father said that Jewish girls do not go to learn at yeshivas or rabbinical schools. I mean, I'm much later in life than she was. Not really. I was born in 1937, but my father said the same thing. He said Jewish girls do not have to go to Hebrew school. I did not go on to become a rabbi, obviously, but I did he let me go to a Yiddish school.
Okay.
That was his concession to letting me learn a little bit more.
Wow.
And I graduated from the Yiddish school, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, being a rabbi is not the only way that women have made headway in the Jewish community. It's one of many expressions of religious leadership, right? Elaine, you were the first female president of our synagogue, and there's other women who can claim that title in their synagogues. Within, you mentioned earlier, you asked the question about, was she the first Orthodox rabbi? And I said very emphatically no. Right now, if you were to say who was the first female Orthodox rabbi, Rabba, she's how she refers to herself, Rabba Sarah or Sarah Horowitz. She is the first one ordained by Rabbi Avi Weiss. Okay, someone else is having funky stuff going on back there. Okay, anyway. So Rabbi Avi Weiss of HIR, the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, which is modern Orthodox, and his ordinations are not universally accepted within the Orthodox movement, but Rabbi Avi Weiss in the Bronx, Riverdale, and Rabbi Daniel Sperber in Israel together, they gave smicha to Rabbi Sarah Horowitz. And just last week, I can't remember her name because it just happened last week. Someone was ordained in Israel and is the first Orthodox female rabbi to be head of a community. So let me see if I can find it here.
Yeah.
I can't find it. Does anyone have her name? I should know her name. I actually met her briefly, but I didn't catch her name. It was just who she was. Give me one more second.
It's in the Jewish Times, Rabbi.
Yes. Does anybody have her name? I should know her name. The place where I keep mistakenly referring to her as Tamar because the community that she's living in is Tamar. But in any event, she graduated from, or is about to graduate from a program called the Manhigot program in Israel, which is at the same seminary where Rivka is. So if they're not ordaining rabbis per se, they're ordaining manhigot, which means leaders, spiritual leaders, and they are trained in Jewish law and they're trained to teach. There's certain things they can't do. They can't lead services. They can't count in a minyan. They can't. They can read Torah amongst women, but not in other circles. Sandy, did you find her name?
No, but I wanted to say that when I just Googled her, because I was out of the room, I'm having a renovation, it's crazy. There's something on PBS, In the Footsteps of Regina Jonas, season 11. So if you go, it seems like PBS ran some sort of program, the first female rabbi in the footsteps of Regina Jonas, season 11 from PBS, but it's on YouTube. So you can probably watch that. It's amazing what you can find when you Google something, and watching a video of it, I guess I didn't watch it yet, but I will, because it's probably portraying her as in that story. So they had a lot of things on PBS, and maybe this was one of the specific things they focused on in season 11 of In the Footsteps of, or whatever.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Did you want to put that information in the chat so other people can find it?
Okay.
Rabbi, her name is Shira Marili Mervis.
Yes, thank you. Shira, that's her name. Okay, so I'll put her. Do you want to put that information for us in the chat, Susie? Yeah, so one of the headlines, there's a few headlines here, but one of them is, in Efrat, Orthodox synagogue appoints Israel's first sole female spiritual leader, and then in parentheses, but don't call her rabbi. So she's not referring to herself as rabbi, but yes, Shira Marili Mervis. Yes.
Still? Are they using the term Maharat?
They're not using the term Maharat. They're, let's see, let me put her name here. Rabbi Shira Marili Mervis. There she is. That's the name. Yes, they're not calling her rabbi. There was a term that was used for a while by Rabbi Avi Weiss and others who were ordained by that was called Maharat. And I think I think the woman who's the head of the Wexner Foundation now, I think she considers herself Maharat. Some of the Orthodox female rabbis, as they are, they call themselves Rabbah. Some of them call themselves Rabbanit. Rabbanit traditionally is the word that was used to mean Rebbitzin. It's the Hebrew equivalent of Rebbitzin. It's someone who's married to a rabbi. But Rabbanit is also used very frequently in the Orthodox world to refer to teachers of high standing, like scholars. Women who are scholarly, who teach in midrashot and yeshivas, day schools, many of them are referred to as Rabbanit. So like I studied with Rabbanit Michelle Cohen-Farber. She has a daily Daf Yomi Talmud class. She happens to be married to a rabbi, so she's Rabbanit by that definition, but she's also considered Rabbanit because she's a very scholarly woman who teaches religious subjects. Okay, any other questions about Regina Jonas, Ray Frank, Shira Mervis, all of these various rabbis or non-rabbis, but who all did rabbinic type of things? Yes, Ruth.
I used to go visit someone at a Catholic nursing home in New York on 72nd in York. I can't remember the name, but they did Jewish services for all the holidays, and it was a Rebbitzin, Orthodox Rebbitzin, who did the services. Now they didn't read Torah, but she did Shabbat services, and she did everything else for the people there.
Yeah,
every Friday.
And as you know, as many of you may know from your own experiences, it's most synagogues. What is that you're showing us, Bobby?
I'm sorry, I interrupted your sentence there. The first Dina Brawler, first ordained female rabbi in Britain.
Okay,
Orthodox. Smicha in London from Rabbi Daniel Sperber.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Rabbi Daniel Sperber was the one of the rabbis who ordained Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz. I mentioned her earlier, and sometimes they spell it Rabba. The term Maharat is an acronym. It's Mem, He, Resh, Taf. I forget what it's. I think it's Morah, Halacha, Ruchanit, something like that. Like a Morah is a teacher, Halacha is about Jewish law, Ruchanit is spiritual, a spiritual leader. Tova Shira Mervis, who says she's not a rabbi, she is graduated from this program called the Manhigot program of Midrash at Lindenbaum. There's all kind of iterations and like, what does it mean to be a rabbi? What I was going to say earlier, and I'll end with this thought, is most synagogues around the world, and I'll mainly speak for the United States, they didn't automatically, even ones that are completely egalitarian today, most of them did not go from non-egalitarian to egalitarian overnight. There were steps that were taken. Now, in the Reform movement, it was more common for that process to be accelerated, right? Whereas, because the role of halakha is different in the Reform movement. And the conservative movement, I mean, still to this day, there are stages that synagogues take in becoming egalitarian. And sometimes the first step is having a female president, like Elaine, right? So that was not a religious position, but a position of leadership within a religious institution. And then in terms of what women were able to do in particular synagogues, there are some synagogues where women don't count in a minyan, but women are allowed to read Torah, or women can lead these parts of services, but they can't lead those parts of services. That many conservative synagogues where girls were able to do a bat mitzvah, but it was Friday night, not Shabbat morning. Or girls were able to do a bat mitzvah, but they couldn't go on the bima. They were like, on kind of the main floor. Like they're all different ways of doing it. Halachically, it's a lot easier to make the case for women giving speeches, anything that's about teaching and learning and giving advice on Jewish law before the highest barrier, the toughest hurdle to overcome halachically are what women can do that relieve other people of their obligation, meaning serving as a shlichat tzibur. So to lead Musaf, which has a Kaddish before it, and there's Kedusha, and there's Kaddish at the end of it, there's that, in order to relieve other people of their obligation, that your leading counts as leading the congregation, you need to make the case that women are obligated, right? And traditionally, Jewish women were not obligated. According to traditional understandings of halakha, women are exempt from laws that are positive time-bound. So a positive time-bound commandment, such as reciting prayers at designated times, if you yourself are not obligated, how can you relieve others of their obligation to do that? How can you say a blessing that other people can say amen to? How can you say a Kaddish with other people responding Yehei Shmei Rabba Mavarach if you yourself are not obligated? And that's one of the halachic issues that was very big in the conservative movement around the time of Rabbi Amy Alberg. Okay, I'll take two more comments and then we'll move on to the part of this class that I am dedicating, well, I should guess the whole thing I'd like to dedicate to, but in particular, the Eshet Chayil part of the class dedicated to Bonnie Joy Farin. Elaine.
Okay, so in our congregation at Temple Beth Am, we did follow a step-by-step procedure. I don't remember exactly the order. It was under Rabbi Barry Dov Lerner, and he followed the United Synagogue Rabbinical Assembly, whatever the guidelines were there. And it did take a couple of years. For example, when I had to open the Ark on the high holidays, they wouldn't allow me to open the Ark for kneeling. Yeah. I had to open it at another prayer. I don't remember which it was, but people did walk out. Eventually, they formed Bet Tefillah. Mm-hmm. The what they call Sons of Israel now, but it did take us a couple of years, and as I said, I don't remember the exact order. First, they were maybe allowed to be counted in a minyan, then maybe they were allowed to read Torah, then maybe girls could become bat mitzvah on Saturday. It was about a 2-year, maybe if I remember correctly, or 3-year process before we became fully egalitarian, where women could do everything, including what they weren't obligated to do. So that was our procedure here.
And it's interesting that you mentioned this piece about the opening of the ark and which prayer, like that is not a halachic decision. That was more probably a sociological issue. It's more about what people are used to.
That's their mind, in their
Right.
mind. How could I be the one to open the ark when the prayers are going up to God? Eventually, several years later, under Stu Abraham's, when he was the president of our temple, they allowed me to come up and rectify that error and let me open the ark for Neela.
Right. But it's interesting that you mentioned that as an example, because that goes beyond halachic concerns. Like it's, it's interesting because this is lahavdil, but when I started at Temple Beth, one of the issues that I brought to the religious ritual committee very early on was about non-Jewish people participation in services. And there were some really strong feelings on the ritual committee about non-Jewish people not being allowed on the bima. And there's no halachic, there's no problem with that. Even when, in fact, when I was installed as rabbi, the mayor, last time I checked, Mayor Fred Tagliarini is not Jewish. He was allowed on the bima. Now, he was not leading a prayer, but he was up there. So there's nothing sacrosanct about the bima itself, but somehow those kind of issues, sociological issues of what doesn't feel right, the same way it doesn't feel right to have a rabbi who doesn't have a beard, who can give birth to children, that just seems wrong, just in terms of how it feels. It's not about, not to most of you on this call, I'm assuming, but to many people, it just felt wrong. It had nothing to do with halacha, because the average person to whom it felt wrong was not necessarily living a halachic lifestyle and following halacha, but it just felt wrong in the same way that it felt wrong for some people to see a non-Jewish person on the bima. Yes, Phyllis.
So by the time I became the second woman president, I not only opened the ark, I also took out the Torahs and handed the Torahs. And it was also during my presidency, or maybe just right after that, we were able to move the girls to Saturday. And the only reason we were able to do that was because we had more dates available. We had less students.
Mm-hmm.
So the girls could be bat mitzvahed on Saturday. So it was a slow progression, but we went step by step, like Elaine said.
Right, but I can say the Friday night versus Shabbat morning distinction, in some conservative synagogues, it was a feeling issue, something that you couldn't really put your finger on halachically, but to some people just didn't feel right. But there are also, in some synagogues, it was halachic concern. Like I went to the East Brunswick Jewish Center for part of high school after I moved from Brooklyn, and girls, the reason why Benot Mitzvah were on Friday night is because there was no Torah reading, and the feeling was that women could not read Torah. So let the girls do something that doesn't involve a Torah reading. If they were to do something on Shabbat morning, it would be really glaring that they're not able to read Torah. That's like the centerpiece of the Shabbat morning service. If you do Friday night, they could do a high percentage of the service, and there's no Torah. There aren't as many halachic barriers to entry there. Yes, Risa.
In between Elaine and Phyllis, you had to have the women being called up to the Torah. And I was not necessarily in favor of this, but I remember certain people saying, you have guys going up to say the blessings over the Torah who know nothing. And then you have Risa who knows all this, and she should be allowed to go up because Risa can do that. We should be, not because literally but to the sense, yes, that I was an educated person.
That's right.
Judaically educated, and if I should be able to go, why should I be denied when you have these phony almonis who go up and don't know how to say the blessing?
Right.
Sure.
Right. But from a halachic perspective, it's interesting because there's this sense, again, if you're not obligated for the mitzvot, how can you go up there and do an aliyah that then requires people to respond? So of course there are, within the conservative movement, by the time this happened, I'm not sure what year this was, Risa, when this was going on at Temple Beth Am, but I don't know if Rabbi Amy Alberg was already ordained. By that point already, the discussions had taken place within the law committee of the conservative movement, finding halachic ways to permit women to have aliyot. So, that may have been a piece of it.
But I'm just, because of the arguments used by the lay people in the congregation, specifically arguing, with other people, that somebody educated fact that she's a woman shouldn't enter it. If somebody educated shouldn't be able to do it, while the uneducated person who just because they happen to have genitalia differently can do it. You know, it just.
Bobby's cracking up. Okay, Joanne, you want to chime in here, and then Betty Ann?
Yeah, that was part of the issue with the mayor, was that he was genitally challenged, and so therefore he was able to get he was able to be on the beam. It wasn't a problem, but it was around that same time Risa and Maxine and I were in that first group to start learning trop. Remember that, Risa?
I don't remember that being at that time, but I remember being in a learning trope.
It was, we were in that first cohort that decided, as long as, the challenge was, as long as we were given the right, didn't we want to learn how to do it right? So we did.
But it was it was you in particular, Joanne, if you recall, who was saying, if we have these people who can't say the blessings properly.
That was me.
I didn't want to name names.
The other thing I said,
but take that to, let's take that to, I'm going to push that point to an extreme in a different scenario. Okay, so we have the tradition of duchening, where Kohanim go up to the bima, and they're doing these priestly blessings, and it's a bloodline thing. If you convert to Judaism, you're considered Jewish in all respects, but you can't ever become a Kohen, and someone who's born not Kohen cannot become a Kohen. And there are times, people come up on the bima who are Kohanim, and maybe their Hebrew is not as good as the Hebrew of someone else sitting next to them in shul, but they're not a Kohen, so they can't go up, right? So
you don't have
the argument that I made at that point, and Risi, you'll remember this one, was in a board meeting. I said, listen, my name is on the check. I am, as well as my husband's. We are members. Why is my membership of less value than his? I can do less. If that's the case, then we'll pay half the dues.
Rabbi, just one comment.
Wait, Elaine, Betty Ann wanted to weigh in, then you can have the last word.
I just want to go from the sublime to the ridiculous. At that time, I was on tennis teams and playing tennis at the Strathmore Bath Club and other places. And the women were told they could not play on the weekend because the men had the priority, because they worked. It didn't matter if you were a woman and worked.
Same thing was true with golf.
This whole thing that goes on, doesn't matter whether it's religion or what. It had to do with the fact that you were a more vulnerable person as a female. And that's the basic thing.
All right, Elaine, you could have the last word. I'll let Carol have the last word. Elaine.
One very quick comment about East Brunswick. When my great niece became bat mitzvah in East Brunswick, it was Rabbi Rogoff who was there, and it was, strictly male. No women were allowed. But my niece wanted me to have an honor, so they finally relented and they let me say the prayer for Israel. That was what I was allowed to do. Nothing to do with the Torah or the Aliyahs or the prayer for Israel. I was allowed to say, which of course I broke my teeth on learning. But that was their one concession to allowing a woman on the bima.
Thanks for sharing that. Carol, you've got the last word on this topic.
Oh, I hope it's worthy, but we've come a long way, baby. But I want to take a big step back. I thought it was part of halakha that a woman's speaking voice was restricted, especially her singing voice. Isn't that part of our tradition?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So within conservative Judaism, that was never an issue. It's called Kol Isha. In fact, more than a couple of years ago, the sisterhood, the women's league pin, the term that was on the pin, it said Kol Isha, which is kind of a pun because Kol Isha means Kol Isha Erva, the voice of a woman is, hard to translate erva, but something we're not supposed to be listening to. It's up to sexual and it's not really abominable. It's more like it doesn't belong in the religious realm. But the sisterhood pin, by having Kol Isha, was saying, yes, this is the voice of sisterhood, is the voice of women. So in the conservative movement, it hasn't been an issue, Kol Isha. In the in Orthodoxy, there is a range of opinions on Kol Isha. Most of the Orthodoxy that I had ever been part of, whether I was growing up or friends of mine who considered themselves Orthodox, or, even where my daughter Rivka is, which is, to the right of where I am, it's very, there's no issue of Kol Isha, but there is within certain Orthodox communities the idea that women's voices are too appealing, alluring, sexual, like for the same reason that women cover their hair, because it would be considered too sex appeal, too sexy, too enticing to men. That's, or at least married women, like the married women, they're supposed to be with their husbands, not supposed to be with other men, and we don't want other men attracted to them in the same way. And hair can be very sexy. Same thing, the voice is very sexy, but it's not really an issue. It hasn't been an issue in the conservative movement. And in the Orthodox movement, the women who have been ordained in various capacities, for the most part, either don't hold by the Kol Isha restriction, or they do, and they still do other rabbinic things. Like, I don't know if I forgot what she's called, Rabbinite Mervis, Shira Mervis, if she will sing in public, but there's still so many things you can do as a rabbi that don't involve singing in public. Okay, so thank you for that last word. For our last, I guess, instead of an hour, it'll be half an hour. We'll do the Eshet Chayil, but I did just want one more comment about the Temple Beth Am piece. Just FYI, and I think I've mentioned this at many ritual committee meetings, is we who are, not everybody here is a member of Temple Beth Am, but those who are, we like to think of ourselves as being an egalitarian synagogue. And I'd say we are 95, 96, 97, call whatever it is in the 90s, but we're not 100% egalitarian. And what makes us not egalitarian, what is the gap with the 100%, is that there are certain things that men do not have a choice, and women do. So take, for example, the talit. A man goes up on the bima to have an aliyah. He is expected to wear a talit. A woman is not expected to wear a talit. There's a choice there. And I remember on quite a few occasions in the ritual committee, I brought up this issue, not necessarily pushing one way or another, because I could see both sides in this issue. There are women who feel very uncomfortable wearing a talit. And if a woman was required to wear a talit, to go up to the bima, it would not be hurting the men, it would be hurting the women who grew up more traditional, or even women who didn't grow up more traditional, but it feels like male's clothing to them. It just doesn't feel like, again, not a halachic argument, but not something they feel comfortable wearing. So that is something that makes a distinction also. It's not just a matter of what you're allowed to do, it's what you're given a choice to do. And if you are given choice and the other gender is not given a choice, it's not 100% equal. Susan, it looks like you're going to have to.
Well, that was a really, in my journey to decide to wear a tallis, that was a really big part of it, because it's the time-bound ritual part of it. And if you're choosing to wear a tallis, does that mean you're accepting time-bound rituals? And that means that you're on the path to be davening regularly and things. And so that was my discussion with Rabbi Levin in terms of trying to figure that out. And then that other piece that you all mentioned was a great, I don't remember, Risa, what you said about the people who didn't understand Hebrew, but it was like a perfect expression, the Hokies. It really the other side of the coin is lots of men wear a tallis and they don't necessarily obligate themselves to those things. And do I feel that I have less of a right to do that, in that same context? But still, there is that time-bound ritual part that I had to struggle with. What am I saying if I'm doing that? Am I on a path for that? And so,
thank you for sharing that. So obviously this is a very, a topic that is near and dear to many of our hearts. And that's one of the reasons I left it for my final class. So for the last piece of this class, the other classes we've
Rabbi,
had.
may I ask one question before you
Elaine always have to have the last word.
No, I have a
Gave
question.
it to Carol, but it's got to be Elaine. Kol hakavod. Go ahead.
I'll think of another one.
Carol's question was excellent. My question is about bat Kohanes and bat Levis. Now, we don't allow bat Kohanes to duchen. We do allow them now to have an aliyah. So why can't they also duchen?
Okay, I'm going to table that discussion. Maybe I can squeeze in one more class of something before I leave, or I can talk to you one way. It's a very large discussion because there actually are halachic distinctions. It's not, the short version is that a Kohen back in the days of the temple was able to share some of his food called truma, the offerings, with his daughter. Anyone who was part of the Kohen household was allowed to eat this truma. But the duchening is more of a direct link to what was allowed in the service in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, clearly, if you're erasing all gender distinctions and you want to be 100% egalitarian, yes, you'd be doing that too. In fact, yesterday in Shul, when we had duchening, there was a Bat Kohen there who did approach me after Shul, and I had this conversation with her. So I'm happy to have it with you offline. Joanne, I guess you're going to have the last word before the Eshet.
I want to know why we don't include the imahot.
And that's another piece too. So I should tell you, the imahot is not an egalitarian issue. It's a separate issue. I mean, it is egalitarian because it's women's, but there's a different issue there's almost two different categories of egalitarianism, let's say. One is what a woman can do, cannot do, is required to do, is permitted to do. That's on the realm of what Susan was talking about, talis, etc., or reading Torah, and even outside of the halachic realm, but similar to what women can do: open the ark, not open the ark, do this prayer, not do that prayer, do this reading. The section the piece that you're talking about the imahot, is more of a liturgical change issue. That's part of a larger discussion of, can you change liturgy at all? Can you add to liturgy? There are some very traditional synagogues that will allow the imahot in the beginning part of the blessing, but not at the end, because the end part of the blessing is considered to be more of what's called the chatima, the closing, the more traditional that traces its way back generations and generations. That's part of Minhag Yisrael. You don't change Amida blessings. But there's a whole other discussion, but it's a little bit different than the issue of what a woman as a woman can do. There's even like a third category, which is how we refer to God. Like, do we refer to God in gender neutral language, or gendered at all, like gendered female, gendered male, go back and forth, just avoid male pronouns. And this, of course, discussion has taken on even greater complexity in our age of non-binary gender identities and transgender issues. Again, just an excellent question, excellent point, but for another time. So let's keep asking these questions. I'm available one-on-one for any of you until June 30th, I think. Okay. The last piece I wanted to do, as I mentioned earlier, throughout this semester, what I've done is the first hour or so, I've been teaching a woman who's post 15th century, so I'm a little modern. Actually, I think I have Joanne Abraham to thank for this, because last year when I was asking for ideas of what to do for wild women this year, because I had almost run out of biblical women. What do you do when you run out of biblical women? Like even the ones without names, we had covered almost all of them over the course of 10 years. Do I go back and do ones I've already done, do them more deeply, add more text? And so I decided to have the first part of the class be the more modern, the women who are post-biblical. And that's when we started with 15th century women. And our last woman, the most recent, is Regina Jonas, who died, Zichron Livracha, in 1944. The second piece of class, though, I have been doing biblical women, returning to some of the women we've studied before. You may not have noticed, but the way I did the curriculum this spring is I had the first woman we studied was first mentioned in the book of Bereshit, Genesis. The second woman, that was Serach Bat Asher. The second woman we studied was from the book of Shmuel, mentioned for the first time. That was Tzipora. The third woman that we studied this semester was Elisheva, who's first mentioned in the book of, her story is in the book of Vayikra. Her name is mentioned a little bit earlier. And then the fourth was Benot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, who are in the book of Bamidbar. So for this fifth and final session of this 2021 year, I decided to do something a little bit different, which is not to take women from the book of Deuteronomy, but to take a very traditional text, the Eshet Chayil, and to look at a midrash that associates each of the lines of the Eshet Chayil with a different woman. So we're not going to look at a biblical text in the classical sense of what we've done in previous classes, reading a narrative, but I'm going to share with you the Eshet Chayil and this particular midrash. And I dedicate this to Bonnie Joy Farin, because if you may recall, those of you who are members of Temple Beth Am or who were at Sisterhood Shabbat a few years back when Bonnie put together, one of her themes was Eshet Chayil. And I'm going to share the screen now with first the original, meaning the biblical text, and then the Midrash itself. So this may look familiar to you from a Sisterhood Shabbat. This Bonnie did type this. The reason it's a little off color here is because I typed it I only had a colored copy of it. I did not have the original. So when I Xeroxed it, it came out a little dark. But this is from a Midrash, a 13th century Yemenite Midrash called Midrash HaGadol, that Bonnie had a book that she read called Praise Her Works, Conversations with Biblical Women by Penina Adelman. And this book is based on this Eshet Chayil Midrash. And before I show you the Midrash, we need to go, I just showed it to you, but I'm going to go back to the original text. So Eshet Chayil is a prayer, a song that is traditionally sung on Friday nights by a husband to his wife over the Shabbos dinner table. In some houses, Eshet Chayil is sung by everyone, referring to the Shabbat as the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, not to the wife per se. It's sung in many different contexts, but the origin is from the book of Mishlei, Proverbs, chapter 31. And it is an alphabetical acrostic. And I meant to put line breaks here, and it didn't work. So let me see if I can go back into, let me go into my thing here. Well, I'll show it to you in the English translation first. Yeah, so there's one line that starts with an aleph, then a bet, gimel, dalet, he, vav, zayin, chet, tet, yud, kaf, lamed, mem, nun, samach, ayin, pei, tzadi, kuf, resh, shin, taf. So all 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Eshet Chayil, here the first verse of it starts with verse 10, but Eshet Chayil starts with an aleph. The next verse, verse 11, starts with a bet, batach. The third starts with a gimel. Then you see the dalet here. So it's Eshet, then batach, then gemalatu, then darsha, hayata is a hey, then batakom is with a vav, zamama, chagra, v'chet, tet, tama, yud, yadeha, kappa, kaf, lamed, lo, marvadim, mem, noda, nun, sadin, samech, ayin, the word is oz, then piha, pei, sophia, tzadi, kuf, kamu, sheker, shin, and then tinu, taf. And this midrash that Bonnie Farin was very fond of, and I was as well. There are actually the midrash. There's a few different midrashim. This particular midrash, this English translation rendered by Bonnie, courtesy of Penina Adelman and with some help from me, it's, as I said, taken from a 13th century Yemenite midrash, but there were other midrashim as well that looked at this section from Proverbs 31, chapter 31, and also did this kind of thing, associated either each line with a different woman or a part of each line to a different woman, sometimes a total to 22 women to correspond to each of the 22 letters of the alphabet. This one actually has 24 women in it because on one of the lines here, the kaf line, there's one woman associated with the first part of the verse and another woman associated with the second part of the verse. Also in this rendition of the Midrash, from Midrash HaGadol, there's two women in the Shin verse. The first half attributed to Vashti, the second to Esther. And the Vashti part of the verse is not considered a compliment. It's considered to be a negative. Say grace is deceptive, beauty is illusory. Vashti was beautiful, but it didn't get her anywhere. It's kind of a negative thing. So not a woman role model. So there are 23 positively portrayed women in this. Now, of course, we can all argue about Vashti and think of her as a feminist heroine, of course, but in the context of how she is described and which line is attributed to her, it's not quite complimentary. It's basically depicting her vanity as being something that's fleeting and not something of lasting value. But I did want to share with you this and go through each of them just to give you a sense, some of these women we have studied together, some we have not, but if nothing else, for you to have name recognition of some of these women. So I did put, I'll put it again in the chat. Midrash. Okay, so I'm going to take it off the screen just so I can see your faces. And if anybody wants to speak, I'll have a better chance of calling on people who want to speak. But I just put it in the chat, this one pager, this Eshet Chayil. So the first line, the first verse of the Eshet Chayil, the Aleph verse, it's Eshet Chayil Mimsa v'rachok mipninim michra, which is translated here as, what a rare find is a capable wife. Her worth is far beyond that of pearls. You might have seen other translations, some that say, what a rare find is a woman of valor. So Eshet Chayil, does that mean woman of valor, or does it mean a capable wife, or amazing woman, like all kind of ways to translate that. Her worth is far beyond that of pearls. You've sometimes seen it translated as rubies instead of pearls. The general, the gist is the same. It's the Aleph line. And the Midrash HaGadol, the Midrash HaGadol says that this line pertains to Naamah. Anyone recall or know or have heard of who Naamah is? Not a well-known. Her name appears in the Tanakh, but her story does not. Her story only appears in Midrashim. Okay, Naamah. So Naamah was the wife of Noach. Okay. Noach and Naamah. And Naamah is spelt in Hebrew. I'll type it in the chat in the Hebrew letters. Naamah. Looks very much like Naomi, as in Ruth and Naomi. We just read that book on Shavuot, on second day. Comes from the word pleasant, Naamah. There is oftentimes a tendency in Midrashim to match together a name that doesn't have a story with a story that doesn't have a name. And so we know that Noah had a wife. She's mentioned as existing. And just so we know that she was the mother of Shem, Ham, and Yafet. We don't know anything about her. So there are Midrashim that expand upon her role. The name Naamah is mentioned in one of the genealogies in Bereshit. And in fact, Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, the rabbi who decided to write children's books, including the book Regina Persisted about Regina Jonas, she wrote a book that was my favorite book to read to my daughter, Eva. I don't know if it was her favorite book or it was my favorite book to read to her, but when somebody gave it to us as a baby gift, and it's a full story expanding on the Midrashim about Noah's wife, Naamah. And while he tended the animals, she tended plants. She brought all of these seeds and plants of different kinds, saplings, to make sure that just as the animals were going to survive, that these various plants and the flowers and other plants would survive. So that's Naamah. The second line of the Eshet Chayil, so the bet line, Batach Balev Ba'ala V'Shalal Lo Yachsar. Would someone like to read the English translation that Bonnie has here for verse 11, her husband?
Where?
It's not on the screen.
I didn't put it on the screen. I sent it as a link.
Oh, sorry.
Her husband puts his confidence in her and lacks no good thing.
Okay, the woman, biblical woman associated here, Sarah. So the first 5 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and Hey, which correspond to verses 10 through 14 of Mishlei, Proverbs 31, are all women who are featured in the book of Bereshit, the first book of the Torah. So Naamah, although she's not featured prominently, we know that the Noach story, Parshat Noach, is in the book of Genesis. The second woman who's mentioned here, Sarah, we know her as, we talked about Imahot, she's number 1 of the Imahot there. And we're going to have all 4 of the Imahot mentioned here. We're going to have Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and Rachel, so not in the order that they appear sometimes when we list the Imahot. Does anyone know why sometimes Leah is mentioned first and sometimes Rachel is mentioned first?
Well, Leah got married first.
Yes, so Leah got married to Yaakov first. She also was the older daughter, right? She was, Laban had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, and he tricked Yaakov into marrying Leah instead of Rachel. Yaakov loved Rachel, wanted to marry Rachel, but then Laban says, lo ya'aseh b'mkomenu. We don't do this in our place to marry off the younger daughter before the older daughter. We got to marry. So I put Leah in. And if you want Rachel, you can work for me an extra 7 years, and I'll throw in 2 for the, not really the price of 1, 2 for the price of 2. But that's why Leah versus Rachel. But sometimes you'll see Rachel listed before Leah because she was considered the loved wife. She is the one who's the mother of Joseph and Benjamin, who were considered Jacob's favorite sons. Not a good thing, as we know as parents, to have favorite children, but so it is. Anyway, so that was the bet verse was Sarah. The Gimel verse, and by the way, this is not a very feminist thing here, or at least affirming feminist text. I've talked before in various Divrei Torah and contexts about a positive versus negative text affirming or a text pro women, minus women stories that are looking at the Torah from a feminist lens. And this is definitely in the negative category. Her husband puts his confidence in her is referring to the story in Parshat Lech Lecha, where Avram requires, demands that Sarah pretend she's his sister instead of his wife, so that when they're in Egypt during the time of famine, that he won't get killed, because he might get killed if Pharaoh is attracted to Sarah and wants to have sex with her and there's a husband in the way, he might kill him. But if it's just a sister, well, no problem. So it's not one of our happier tales of women's lib, but this is why Sarah gets this verse according to this Midrash. The Gimel verse, the verse 12, is Gamalatu Tov V'lo Ra Kol Yemei Chayeha. She is good to him, never bad, all the days of her life. That's Rebecca. Daled verse, Darshat Semru Fishtim Vatas B'Chafetz Kapeha. She looks for wool and flax and sets her hand to them with a will. That's Leah. And then the Hay verse, verse 14, she is like a merchant fleet bringing her food from afar, Rachel. And as I said, all of these first 5 letters of the alphabet are all women who appear in the book of Bereshit, ranging from Parshat Noach to Parshat Lech Lecha, Vayera, Chaye Sarah, Parshat Toldot, Parshat Vayetze, etc. And now we move on to the Vav, Zayin, and Chet verses of this the biblical text from Proverbs 31, and what the Midrash does with each of these verses, which woman they associate each letter with. So Vav, would someone like to read the English translation of Vav, which is Vatakom be'od laila, vatiten teref, leveta b'chok l'naroteha. Risa.
She rises while it is still night and supplies provisions for her household, the daily fare of her maids.
Okay, and who's the woman that is associated with that?
Batya.
According to the Midrash, Batya. Batya sometimes referred to as Bitya because it's in Hebrew Bet Taf Yud Hey, which depending on how you vocalize it, what vowels you put underneath those consonants, it could be Batya or Bitya. Who was Batya? Bitya?
Was she Pharaoh's wife?
Daughter.
Okay.
So Batya, I'll put it in Hebrew right here. Because you may recognize the word bat, right? Bat as in daughter. Bat Ya bat is daughter. Ya is part of God's name, Yud He Vav He. So even though she was biologically the daughter of Pharaoh, she's the one who saved little baby Moses in his basket in the Nile River. The Midrash refers to her as Batya because they view her as having converted to whatever Judaism was at that time, Batya, the daughter of God. So that's the Vav line. The Zion line, which is verse 16, I'll read it and someone else could read it in English. The Hebrew is Zamama Sadevati Kachehu Mipri Kapeha Nata Karem. Someone like to read that one? Anyone? Susan, go ahead.
Okay, she sets her mind on an estate and acquires it. She plants a vineyard by her own labors.
Okay, so who does the Midrash associate that line with? Yocheved. And who was Yocheved?
Moses'
mother.
Right. So Moses had the mother, the adoptive mother, Batya, who was the daughter of Pharaoh, and he had his biological mother, Yocheved. And verse 17 here, which is the Chet line, is another woman who I guess could be considered a maternal figure to Moses, even though she was his biological sister, which is Miriam. The Chet verse is Chagra be'oz motneha v'te'ametz zera'oteha, translated here as she girds herself with strength and performs her tasks with vigor. That line in the Midrash is associated with Miriam. So as we had verses Aleph through Hey versus the letters, when I say verses Aleph through Hey, it's not verses 1 through 5, it's the verses that begin with the letters Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. Those are all women from the book of Genesis, Bereshit. These next three women, Vav, Zion, and Chet, Batya, Yocheved, and Miriam, are all from the book of Exodus, Shemot. And then for the rest from the letter Tet all the way to Shin, Taf doesn't have a woman associated with her, with its letter. They're from all different places in Nevi'im and Ketuvim, mostly Nevi'im, the Nevi'im section of the Tanakh, including the books of Shoftim, Judges, the book of Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet, Samuel 1 and 2, Malachim Aleph, Malachim Bet, Kings 1 and 2. You have some of the books from Ketuvim, scriptures, including Megillat Esther, Megillat Ruth, but they're not in chronological order here. So from Tet on, we're not following chronology of how the Tanakh is assembled. The verse that's called verse 18 here, that begins with the letter Tet, Ta'ama kitov sachra lo yichbe balayla nera. She sees that her business thrives, her lamp never goes out at night. That's Hannah, and you can find her story in the book of Shmuel Aleph, chapter 1, verse 1, and also chapter 2. It's a haftarah that we read on Rosh Hashanah, day 1. So who was Hannah?
Oh, baby and Mama Bear.
Mother.
Whose mother?
She prayed silently for her son because she didn't have any child.
Yeah, and who did she give birth to eventually?
I always get my name wrong.
The hint is the book that it's in. Okay. It's Shmuel Aleph. So
Shmuel. For some reason, that name never comes into my head.
Okay, so Hannah, now forever after, we'll remember that Hannah gave birth to Shmuel, right? Right. Okay. And if you forget, look in the Machzor or look in the Eshet Chayil Proverbs. The next line, the Yud line, which in Hebrew is Yadea Shilcha Bakishar V'chapea Tamchu Falech. The Yud line, she sets her hand to the distaff, her fingers work the spindle, is Yael. And Yael is featured in Beshalach that we read on, the Haftorah that we read on Shabbat Shira from Parshat Beshalach. The Haftorah is not from Parshat Beshalach, the Torah readings Beshalach, but the Haftorah is from the book of Shoftim, from Judges.
That one I remember.
Who is Yael? Anyone?
She killed Sisera with a tent pin.
Yes, and Sandy, did you want to add something else of what story she's told? In what story she's told?
No, I just wanted to say that my niece was named Devorah Yael, and they had to soften it and give her a third name, Sarah, because they thought Devorah Yael was going to be too tough of a Hebrew name to go through life with, so they tacked on the Sarah at the end for the softness. So that was
interesting.
I always remember, and she's just like her name. Don't get in front of her.
That's really funny. So it's interesting. So you actually did answer my question, which is Devorah and Yael. Devorah is the chieftain, the judge from the book of Shoftim, who is the main character in Judges 4 and 5. And she shares the spotlight, though, with two other people. She shares the spotlight with Barak ben Avinoam. Barak was the male army officer, or the guy who took them to war against the Canaanites, including Sisera, who was the head of the Canaanite army. So Deborah was protagonist, but another protagonist, and there is Yael. Yael is someone who's not quite Canaanite, not quite Jewish. She's kind of an in-between. She's friends with both sides. She is a descendant, we think, of Yitro. So there's some connection there to the Moses family. But in any event, Yael is the one who actually kills Sisera. So while Barak was the one out there fighting the battle writ large against the whole Syrian army, not the Syrian army, the Canaanite army, it was Yael who literally the final nail in the coffin, although not so literally. It's more like the tent peg in the forehead. She gets him. It's a very gory story. We studied this in a Wild Woman class many years ago. Okay, verse 20 of the Eshet Chayil in Proverbs 31 is the Chaf verse, begins with Kap haparsa le'ani v'yadea shilcha le'evyon. This verse, according to Midrash HaGadol, is attributed to two different women. The first half is attributed to the widow from Zarephath, and the second part is associated with Naomi. Naomi as in the Ruth and Naomi story, where you go, I will go, your people shall be my people. Ruth is the one who says those words to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi's the one from Bethlehem, Beit Lechem, who her husband and her two sons die when they're in Moab during the time of famine. She comes back to Bethlehem with Ruth. And the widow from Zarephath is a lesser known story. I did teach it in one Wild Women class a bunch of years ago. She doesn't have a name in the text. She's just referred to as the Tzarfit. And she's featured in the book of Malachim Aleph, 1 Kings. It's chapter, I want to say 7. I can't remember exactly. It's in 1 Kings. It's during the time of Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi. And this is a resurrection story. So yes, we have them too in our Jewish tradition. So the widow of Zarephath is someone who, she was a widow. She had a son who was referred to as an orphan, although his mom was still alive, dad was not. And that's an orphan was considered to be someone who was fatherless. And that boy ended up dying, and Elijah brought him back to life. Eliyahu Hanavi brought him back to life. And she gives generously to the poor. That those particular words are associated with her because this woman from Zarephath was someone who used to host Eliyahu. She used to host Elijah in her house. And you can imagine how angry she was and how sad she was when her son died. Like, here I am providing hospitality to this Navi, to this prophet, and my son dies, really? But he ends up coming back to life. Verse 21, which is the Lamed verse. Lamed is Lo tira leveta mishala ki chol beita lavu shanim. Would someone like to read that one in English? Verse 21. Someone have it in front of them? Denise, go ahead.
She is not worried for her household because of snow, for her household is dressed in crimson. Rahav.
So Rahav, sometimes her name is written in transliteration as Rahab, R-A-H-A-B. She is featured in the book of Joshua, Yehoshua. She is the harlot who hides the two spies who come to check out Jericho, as in Joshua's Battle of Jericho. And the way she is able to indicate to Joshua and the Israelite army that that this is her house, and Joshua promised, and the Meraglim, the spies promised, that her family would not be destroyed during this conquest. She puts a crimson thread out of her window in Jericho. And that's where the crimson connection is and why Rachav is connected to this particular verse. Verse 22 in Proverbs 31, that's a verse that begins with the letter Mem. And it's Marvadi Mastela Shesh Ve'argaman Levusha. She makes covers for herself. Her clothing is linen and purple. Every Friday night when Adi sings this to me, I say, that's what I want on my tombstone. He says, that's what you want on your tombstone? And a little about what color you like, not about something positive you did. I'm like, I'm not going to pat myself on the back and say what positive things I did or didn't do. But purple, that's a neutral thing. Anyway, so then you are around and I'm not around and Adi's still around. Make sure that goes on my tombstone. Very heavy duty.
May that be a long time from now.
May it be a long time from now. So Bathsheba, okay. You've heard of Bathsheba. So Bathsheba is in one of the wives of David, mother of Solomon. And she originally was the wife of Uriah HaChiti, and David slept with her and got Uriah killed. Not a very positive depiction of David, but that's Bathsheba. Verse 23 begins with the letter Nun. Here we are. Noda basherim bala b'shivto im ziknei aretz. It's her husband is prominent at the gates as he sits among the elders of the land. That's Michal bat Shaul. She was daughter of King Saul. She also was wife of King David. And you can read her story. We studied it once over these past 10 years, at least once, maybe twice. 1 Samuel 19, 1 Samuel 26, and then she appears for the last time again in 2 Samuel 6. So Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. Verse 24 of Proverbs 31 is the verse that starts with Samech. Going back to the Nun verse, the Michal. So I said this is not the only Midrash that goes through the Eshet Chayil and assigns each letter of the Hebrew alphabet to 1 or 2 Jewish women, biblical women. There's others, and there's one of the Midrashim, I think it's Midrash Mishlei or Midrash Tadshe, I forget which one, associates Michal not with the letter Nun, but with the letter Ayin. And Ayin, the word is Oz, which is strength, and Oz is sometimes used to refer to tefillin. And according to the Babylonian Talmud, at least one time in the Babylonian Talmud, it's mentioned that Michal wore tefillin. So that's why in some of these Eshet Chayil Midrashim, she's associated with that line, but here is Nun. Samech line is associated with Hatzlel Poni. Who's Hatzlel Poni? She's the mother of Shimshon, Eshet Manoach. That's the one, Risa, that I think you confuse with Hannah sometimes, right? Because it's also a barren woman who wants a child. This is the Haftorah that we'll be reading in Shul next week. Parshat Naso, the Haftorah from the book of Judges, Shoftim, chapter 13. It culminates in the birth of Samson. And Judges 13, in the Torah portion, she's not given a name. She's Eshet Manoach, and the husband's name is given, Manoach. But he's a very passive character, very fitting that his name is Manoach, comes from the word nach, lanuach, to rest. He's kind of the guy who doesn't get it. She gets it. And in the Midrash calls her Hatzlel Poni. And Hatzlel Poni, you can say it comes from the word tsel or tsalil, tsalil as in ringing, like the ringing of a voice. She heard the voice of God. Or tsafun, as in the step of the Passover Seder. With the afikomen, the afikomen's hidden, we try to find it. So she's someone who had a hiddenness, a hidden connection with God, but ultimately gave birth to a very visible manifestation of God, which was a child, Shimshon, Samson. Verse 25, the Ayin verse, this is Elisheva. Elisheva, wife of Aharon, Aaron the Kohen. Her name is first mentioned in the book of Shmot in a genealogy, chapter 6 of Shmot, but then her story, she doesn't really have a story, but her sons, Nebuch, Nadav, and Avihu are the ones who get killed at the altar on the 8th day of the consecration, the ordination of the priests. That's Elisheva. Elisheva also is the sister of Nachshon. Her father is Aminadav. Nachshon ben Aminadav, according to Midrash, was the first of the Israelites to jump into Yamsuf, into the Sea of Reeds, at Yetziat Mitzrayim, at the Exodus from Egypt. Verse 26, the Pei verse, Pia parcha b'chochma, her mouth is full of wisdom, her tongue with kindly teaching. That's Serach bat Asher, also a woman who doesn't have a story in the Torah, only in the Midrash. She's the daughter of Asher, granddaughter of Yaakov, Genesis 46. And again, she's mentioned in a genealogy in Numbers 26. And then the Tzadi verse, verse 27, is the wife of Ovadia. Ovadia was someone who was leader in the king's court during the time of Elijah, King Ahab and Jezebel, Achav and Izebel and Eliyahu. And then there's a story about her in 2 Kings 4, in which she interacts with the prophet Elisha. So, and then the Midrash associates her as the wife of Ovadia, because she uses the term Eved, servant, many times in her description of her husband. Verse 28, the Kuf verse, is the Shunammite woman, also in 2 Kings 4, but it's the second part of the chapter. The first part of the chapter is this wife of Ovadia. The second half of chapter 4 is this woman, she's just called the Shunammite woman. This is the Haftorah for Parshat Vayera. If I remember correctly, that was your bat mitzvah portion, Risa. And that's it's the same Torah portion as Parshat Vayera, and the two connections with Vayera is hospitality. Sarah and Abraham provide hospitality to the three angels in the Torah portion, and in the Haftorah portion, we have this woman, the Shunammite, providing hospitality to Elisha, and it also features a resurrection. One could consider Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, as a resurrection story of sorts, because he was supposed to die and he ends up living, and some Midrashim actually do describe what happened on Mount Moriah as there being a death of Isaac and a resurrection. We're in the home stretch here, verse 29. The Reish verse is, many women have done well, but you surpass them all. Rabat banot asuchayil ve'at alit al kulana. That's Ruth. And then Shin, sheker hachen vehevel hayofi, first part of the verse, attributed negatively to Vashti. Grace is deceptive, beauty is illusory. And then the last part of that verse, Isha yirat Hashem hi titzalal. It is for her fear of the Lord that a woman is to be praised, and that refers to Esther. And the top verse, at least according to this Midrash, Midrash HaGadol, that is featured in Penina Adelman's book that Bonnie Joy Farin used as the basis of her Sisterhood Shabbat, thematic Shabbat a few years ago. This last verse, verse 31 of chapter 31 of Proverbs, of Mishlei, is a catch-all that is supposed to encompass all of the righteous women in biblical tradition, in Jewish life. The rest of the women is really what she put in parentheses here, but I would refer to them as the Nashim Tzidkaniot, the righteous women that have made Jewish history what it is, going all the way back to the first women in the book of Bereshit, all the way through to Regina Jonas, who is the last most modern woman we studied, and beyond. And of course, you in this generation and your children and grandchildren. So that is all, folks. Shabbat Shalom, almost, but not quite yet. But thank you all for joining. And this is my last Wild Women.
Oh, it was a wild ride, and we all enjoyed it for many years.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
It's been my pleasure, absolute pleasure. And speaking of Wild Women, there's a Sisterhood Shabbat this Friday. Sandy, do you want to give details about that?